In my last video, I went over the potential leaks that we're seeing Vecna and Dracula as the next two killers in Dead by Daylight, which if you haven't seen, I highly recommend you go and watch that first. It's not necessary, but it helped make sure we're all on the same page. Back to the topic at hand though. I wanted to make a follow-up video to that one for two main reasons. For one, after reading all of your comments and just thinking on my own, I have a few more points both for and against these leaks. And for two, I wanted to ask and answer one question. If Vecna is in chapter 32 like Gumpy says, what does that say for the rest of year 9 of DBD? For example, just how likely is FNAF in this scenario? And is Castlevania still possible even if Dungeons & Dragons doesn't come in? I'll get to that in a bit, but first, some new points concerning the leaks themselves. To start us off, I think it's pretty important to cover Stranger Things. This is primarily because Stranger Things has her own Vecna, sparking a number of different ideas and conversations as far as this rumor is concerned. First, the idea of Vecna from D&D coming in as the base killer with Vecna from Stranger Things as a skin, and vice versa. While this might seem like an alright idea initially, the two characters don't really have similar power sets. Not to mention that we have never seen a skin for a licensed character transform them into a character from a completely different license. This isn't to say we can't have one and not the other though. They can always bring them in as separate killers. Second, the idea that Gumpy's information of D&D Vecna is outdated. More specifically, how getting him in the game would be behavior's roundabout way of getting Stranger Things Vecna in the game, since the first chapter was removed from the game for a substantial period of time. However, after they got the license back in November, some people think they could cancel the deal with D&D and replace it with Stranger Things. While this might seem likely as well, I'm not sure behavior would be willing to completely ruin a relationship with D&D by replacing their character with the better Vecna. Besides, chapters take about a year to develop, and the time period from Stranger Things' return in chapter 32 is just a little over 6 months. And with the aforementioned point of the two Vecnas being fairly different power-wise, it just doesn't seem that feasible. Third, the notion that D&D Vecna isn't big enough of a character for behavior to go for, especially for an anniversary. And this isn't a terrible point. Sure, Stranger Things Vecna was blatantly inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, but the former is much more popular and relevant. I do think they'd be willing to bring D&D Vecna into the game in general, but for an anniversary? Not to mention we've seen a shift from licensed anniversaries to original ones lately, having gotten Roots of Dread and End Transmission in a row. I wouldn't say this is a huge point necessarily, and I still think the leaks are more credible than not, but it is certainly something I'm going to keep in the back of my head moving forward. Moving on from Stranger Things, what other new points are there to cover? For one, I've heard the thought that D&D Vecna is too powerful for Dead by Daylight tossed around a few times. And to put it simply, Freddy Krueger, Pinhead, Nemesis, Sadako, all pretty powerful characters, and yet all of them are in DBD no problem. The list doesn't exactly end at those four either. In other words, behavior is no stranger to nerfing characters in order for them to fit in the fog. Next, a potential survivor for a Dungeons & Dragons chapter. Multiple people brought up the idea of this chapter being a great way for us to get our first non-human survivor, such as a Dragonborn or Elf. And while I agree it would be very cool and fairly fitting for D&D, I'm just not sure this is something behavior would go for. Granted, that's not exactly a good counterpoint and I don't have anything beyond I don't think so, but still. Again, I absolutely love this idea, but I'm just skeptical is all. There's also the point that Castlevania is a license owned by Konami, who behavior worked with for the Silent Hill chapter. So, much like the Alien and Predator situation, they already have an established connection with the license holder, making this at least a little more likely. Lastly, the Gothic Tales collection. A fairly new set of cosmetics, this collection undoubtedly has some fantasy elements. Each of the sets tells a short story through each individual item, and Vittorio's in particular tells one of him stumbling into a dark castle, the master of which seems to have a strong darkness about him. Shortly thereafter, Vittorio feels a sharp pain in his neck, caused by the master. Now just think about this for a second. A story revolving around a dark castle, with a mysterious master who attacks people in the neck? Sounds a bit familiar to the license proposed for chapter 33, does it not? While this could just be a fun little reference, I'm willing to bet not. Before I continue, real quick, if you're enjoying this video so far, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. You can always change your mind later, and those are some of the best ways to motivate me to keep making more videos like this. And I'm trying to get to 2K before the 8th anniversary comes around, so I'd really appreciate it. Thanks for listening to my shameless self-promotion, and back to the video. With all of those points covered, it's time to address the question I proposed earlier. If Gumpy's leaks turn out to be false, what instead can we expect for the next two Dead by Daylight chapters? And what other guesses can we make for year 9? First, let's address chapter 32. As I said in my last video, I'm fully expecting this chapter to be original if it isn't Vecna for two main reasons. A, we haven't had any shortage of licensed content recently, so there'd be no obligation by behavior to give us a license. And B, the past two anniversaries have been original. Granted, it's only 2, and I still think licensed anniversaries are a possibility for the future, but considering both this and Point A, I'd say it's more likely than not that this one's original. But if it's not, and it's not Vecna, what licenses can we expect to come in this May? Well, I don't want to spend too long on this, so I've assembled a list of what I believe to be the 3 most likely licenses for this chapter. Again, this isn't counting D&D Vecna or the possibility for an original. Those are the most and second most likely possibilities respectively. Number 1 on this list is Predator. I've already gone over why he's so likely to come in at some point in various other videos, so I won't go too in depth. But this is mainly because Alien and Predator are owned by the same license holder, Predator has been a highly requested chapter for years, and Alien's Grid Xenomorph skin, which is a look taken straight from the first Alien vs Predator movie. One thing I said in previous videos, though, is how I don't think they'd wait more than a year between an Alien and a Predator chapter. After thinking on it some more, I honestly think it's more likely they wait more than a year. Even still, Predator is a killer we have all but confirmation we're getting at some point, making it a top pick for any chapter until we eventually get him in. Number 2 I'll have to give to Stranger Things. We've had the license back in the game for a few months now, and considering both how successful the first chapter was, and the various characters they could bring in for a second chapter, this isn't a question of if, but rather of when. Similarly to Predator, I think it's much more likely they wait a while before giving us a second Stranger Things chapter, but it still beats out nearly every other license. Last but not least, at number 3, I'd like to put Friday the 13th. The lawsuit's been over for a while now, it's most certainly an anniversary-worthy license, and we know both fans of DBD and DBD themselves really want him in the game. I mean, I'm not even a fan of Friday the 13th, and even I want him in the game. Moving on from Chapter 32, let's take a look at Chapter 33. Before I give my list, I like to tackle a question I briefly brought up at the beginning of the video. Even if Chapter 32 isn't Vecna, could we still see Dracula come in for Chapter 33? And while it'll certainly make it less likely to happen, I'd have to say yes. This is primarily due to the aforementioned point of it being a Konami-owned IP. But even though Castlevania X DBD wasn't a super talked about collaboration prior to this, people have wanted the vampire in this game for a while. It's also fairly likely we'd get a castle map for this chapter, a highly requested map for the game. And due to the arcade machine on Greenville Square I brought up in my last video, we could reasonably expect to see Simon and Richter come in for this chapter. That aside though, how does it rank in comparison to other possibilities? Instead of a top 3 like I did for Chapter 32, I'd like to give my top 5 for this chapter. Now this may just be copium, but at the number 1 spot, I'm going to have to put FNAF. I mean, come on. Chapter 33 lines up nearly perfectly with FNAF's 10th anniversary, and we saw the release of the FNAF movie last October, and with just how successful it was, it definitely caught behavior's attention. On the topic of the movie, Blumhouse was the one who produced it, the same company helping with the Dead by Daylight movie. It may be a controversial collaboration for a lot of DBD fans, and maybe even DBD themselves, but let's face it, this would be the most successful chapter to date by miles upon miles. Whether they like it or not, if Behavior wants an absolute home run of a chapter, they know what to do. For number 2, I'm going to put Predator, for aforementioned reasoning. Obviously, this assumes he isn't Chapter 32. Number 3 on this list is Stranger Things, once again for aforementioned reasoning, and once again assuming it isn't Chapter 32. Number 4, I'd like to give the Castlevania. While not as likely as similar licenses like Stranger Things and Predator, it is still owned by a license holder Behavior has previously worked with, along with the other points I brought up earlier. Number 5 is a tie between Friday the 13th and an original chapter in my mind. While I still think they'd want to save Jason Voorhees for an anniversary, I know Behavior would take what they can get. And while I think it's more likely than not this chapter is licensed, I think an original is more likely than any other license apart from the 5 on this list. As far as chapters 34 and 35 are concerned, it's a bit harder to pinpoint what they are this far in advance. The only reason I was so confident in saying they were both originals in my last video is I was assuming 32 and 33 were D&D and Castlevania respectively. But while I don't want to go in depth for either chapter as I did for 32 and 33 in this hypothetical, I will say it's likely they try and do 2 originals and 2 licenses for year 9. If it's an original, I obviously can't guess much. But if it's a licensed chapter, I'd refer back to the list of all the licenses I brought up in this video. Maybe toss Candyman and Slenderman in there too, just for good measure. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe as it helps me out way more you might think. And according to YouTube statistics, only 2.5% of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. If you have something to say about the video, the theories themselves, or you just want to say hi, feel free to leave a comment and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I make it a commitment to respond to everyone, or almost everyone at least. And if you really want to show your support, consider becoming a channel member. For just $3 a month, you get a lot of perks. In fact, you could have seen this video early if you were a member, and by several hours at least. On that note, huge shout out to Stanis Swag and Mario Blue, currently my only 2 channel members. And real quick before I close off today's video, I have a bit of an atypical promotion. A few months ago, me and some friends started working on a Friday Night Funkin' mod. I know, a Dead by Daylight theory YouTuber promoting a Friday Night Funkin' mod. To be fair, I did say it was atypical. Anyway, it's coming along really well so far, and I'm not just saying that. I know a lot of you appreciate the quality I put into these videos, and I'm holding this mod to a similar standard. I won't waste any more of your time by showing any gameplay from the mod in this video, not to mention I don't want to spoil too much, but if you are interested, I encourage you to check out @VersusTrashSquad on Twitter. Link to that is at the top of the description. I'll be posting on there when the demo's out, and there's even a few teasers for the mod there in our Help Wanted ad. Feel free to follow my own personal Twitter while you're there too, @NotK0R0. Regardless, I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.